I want to welcome you to this real talk dialogue about COVID-19 vaccine. So this evening, we will hear from our panel of physicians and students. We will also view the webinar from blackdoctors.org. The purpose of today's town hall is really to provide you with information that we've not really received from mainstream media. It is to hear from Black healthcare providers who have been very involved in the development as well as the clinical trials as it relates to the COVID-19 vaccine. I'd like to, and then from there, we will hear from our moderator, Dr. Cerise Hunt, who will ask and get reactions from our panelists about the webinar, the video that we will see. And then from there, we will open it up for questions because we really want this to be a dialogue that we hear from you, our community members. Before we start the formalities of our program, I'd like to take a moment to thank some folks. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Cerise Hunt for volunteering so willingly to be our moderator this evening. Dr. Dominic Martinez for the logistical help, Jamil Mallory, Hillary Bolan for interpreting services. Also, if you need to change your interpretation indicator on the bottom right of your screen. If you are wanting English, please turn it to English. If you want Spanish, please indicate Spanish. I'd like to thank Josh Blake and Latifa Miller for monitoring our Q&A this evening. I'd like to thank our panelists, Dr. Fernando Hogan, Dr. Terry Richardson, Dr. Jared Ivanich, Dr. Rhonda Coleman. I'd like to thank our future physicians, current researchers, Stephanie Wangu, Vicky Garza, and Kalia Habir. I'd also like to thank our IT assistant, Mike Effler, who is providing IT services for us this evening. As I said earlier, this video that we will be viewing is from blackdoctors.org. It was a live video, which was made on November the 18th, 2020. What you're going to hear tonight is you're going to hear numbers about people who have been affected across our nation. And that information was captured again on November the 18th. I just want to provide you with some updated information about the number of cases in our nation today. There are 387,000 deaths nationally, 130,000 immunizations nationwide. We're going to drill down that a little bit to our state. Let me go back. Currently, there are 23.2 million cases in the United States, 387,000 deaths. We know that there is 130,000 immunizations that have happened nationwide. We're going to drill that down a little bit and narrow it down to our Colorado cases. 368,000 cases, 5,364 deaths, 886 patients hospitalized. We are in a crisis. It is so important that we hear from people that look like us about the development of the vaccine so that we can make informed decisions that hopefully will allow us to make the best decision for ourselves as it relates to the vaccine. That being said, I would like for us to take a moment, please, in silence to remember those that we've lost in this pandemic, to give gratitude to every single person that's been on the front line, not just individuals that have been in the hospital and the caregivers. I'm talking, or the folks that are in the nursing homes. I'm talking about the folks that have sat by the bedside, risked their own lives for their loved ones. I'm talking about the people who have opened up the grocery stores, who have cleaned the hospitals, who have opened the gas stations so that the frontline workers can be there for the patients and families, the food service workers. I want us to take a moment and recognize all that have been affected by this pandemic. Thank you. Now we're going to move to land acknowledgement by Dr. Jared Ivanich.
Yes, thank you for having me. We humbly acknowledge that the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus is located on the traditional and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people. Our campus resides on the unceded lands of the Arapaho people, established in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851. We recognize the enduring presence of more than 40,000 Indigenous peoples in the greater Denver area. The sprawling urban American Indian and Alaska Native presence in Denver consists of other tribes native to Colorado, such as the Apache, Comanche, Shoshone, and Ute community members, yet is now home to numerous other Indigenous peoples from many of the 560 plus federally recognized tribes in this country. Together, we acknowledge the history of genocide and ongoing systemic inequalities while respecting treaties made on this territory as a step towards reconciliation and strengthening relationships with Indigenous peoples. We give thanks to the past, present, and future stewards of this land and respect all tribal nations' sovereignty and rights to self-governance. We recognize the lessons, including many medical lessons and public health lessons Indigenous communities have offered and continue to teach us.
Thank you very much for that land acknowledgement. We are about to start viewing the webinar, the video. It is again through blackdoctors.org. There is a national task force made up of physicians, National Black Nurses of America, other HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, who have been very instrumental in working with and in the development of the COVID vaccines. This particular video was again made on November the 18th, 2020, for the purpose to really speak to healthcare providers of color and the community to have open, transparent dialogue, to raise awareness about clinical trials, and again, to provide information that mainstream media does not give us. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our IT professional, Mike, who will start the video.
Social media outlets of all of our participating organizations. Additionally, it is being recorded and will be housed on the blackdoctors.org website. So exhaustion, impatience, and burnout are creating new risks for the coronavirus cases that are beginning to soar throughout the world. There are nearly 56 million people that have been infected globally. In the United States, we have surpassed 11 million cases and nearly 250,000 deaths. More than 150,000 new cases are occurring daily in the United States. Our healthcare providers are lost on the front line. Hundreds of US healthcare workers have died fighting COVID. And just want you to look at the number that's coming from the Kaiser Health Newswork and Guardian News that is showing that we have reached 1,396 deaths. Did those individuals have to die? And if you look at those numbers, you will see that nurses are leading the pack, followed by doctors and other healthcare professionals. And of course, we all know that when we look at the race and ethnicity of those deaths, Blacks represent 70% of those deaths. So tonight, this is a unique learning and communication opportunity for all of us who are providers of professional healthcare services to our patients and the community. We are the trusted voices in the community, and we hope that this program will provide you with the acknowledged benefit and from the experts in the field of vaccines who are really trusted agents. This event is crucial because we know we are in the middle of this pandemic, and it's threatening our communities now and probably into the foreseeable near future. Certainly, it's going to impact all of us in terms of our Thanksgiving holiday and moving on to the other parts of the holiday for the rest of this year. So tonight, we aim to provide an opportunity to translate and communicate information in a clear and objective manner in order that you can provide the necessary and appropriate care and counsel for your patients. So let me move on to this stellar panel that we have that is a very dynamic panel. And I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction overview for them. I think their bios are on our website because we want this to be a discussion. The first panelist is Dr. Kismekia Corbett. She is the Senior Research Fellow and Scientific Lead in the vaccine research at NIH. She will be followed by Dr. James Hildreth, who is President and Executive Officer at the Mcmurray Medical College. Following him will be Dr. Stefan Wallace. He is the Director of External Relations at COVID-19 Prevention Network. And Dr. Reeds Tuckson will follow him as the Managing Director of Tuckson Health Connections. And we will end our discussion with Dr. Melissa Mcmurray Heath, who is the President and CEO of Biotechnology Innovation Organization, better known as BIO. We hope that you will put your questions in the chat box and we will have this robust discussion. So again, Dr. Corbett, you're the lead.
Hi, and thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Brown. So I am Kismekia Corbett. I am the scientific lead for vaccine research at the NIH in the Vaccine Research Center. I was largely involved in developing the vaccine for coronavirus, particularly the one that's being developed by Moderna. And I'm happy to field questions about the development process, the work that we've done for several years leading up into this moment, the intricate details about the collaboration between the National Institutes of Health and Moderna, and any questions that you have about how the vaccine is made, how it was tested preclinically, and also in phase 1 trials to inform how it moved very rapidly through the clinical trial trajectory and to what is soon to be probably EUA and then licensure. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hildreth, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Dr. Brown. I'm really happy to be a part of this important conversation. I'm President and CEO of Mcmurray Medical College. Our organization has been taking a lead here in Nashville for COVID-19 testing, making sure that minority communities have access to it. We're partnering with churches and local organizations. My own personal background is I'm an immunologist and virologist. I've been studying viruses since 1978. I've been deeply involved in the fight against HIV. I'm on the FDA committee that will review the vaccines for approval. And we are actually, in fact, going to be testing one of the vaccines for COVID-19 here at Mcmurray. And so I can answer questions about the approval process, how the vaccines actually work. And I really want to talk about why it's so important that we, people of color, are part of the studies that are ongoing right now. Thank you. Very happy to be with you tonight.
Thank you. Dr. Wallace.
Hello, hello. Thank you all. I am excited about this panel and this conversation. Director of External Relations for the COVID-19 Prevention Network and the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. So I'm looking forward to talking a bit about the clinical trials sort of phases, the specifics and considerations regarding the Belmont Report and informed consent, how patient and participant safety is considered while participating in clinical trials, as well as the importance of diversity in our clinical trials. And then finally, how we've leveraged our HIV experience through the Division of AIDS funded clinical trials networks to support a COVID-19 response. Thank you.
Yes. Dr. Tuxum.
I'm happy to be here as well, and to follow up on something that that Dr. McDougall mentioned. We have been able to create an unprecedented relationship between the organized leadership of Black health and the Black community. We have brought together all four of the historically Black medical schools, the National Medical Association, the Cobb Institute, the National Black Nurses Association, along with the National Urban League and blackdoctor.org, having conversations with America. We've had 2 major town halls to date that have given us extraordinary access and insight to how African-American people in our communities are thinking about this vaccine. We reached 250,000 people already. We have a 3rd one coming up in a couple of weeks, and we will have a major conversation on Friday with all of the leadership of the Black media, radio, television, magazine, print, and so forth. And so I'm happy to be able to sort of give some of the perspectives of what we're seeing as we talk to Black America, and also have a particular interest in the dissemination process and some information also if you're curious about the reimbursement practices as well. Glad to be with you.
Thank you. Dr. Mcmurray Heath.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Brown. My name is Michelle Mcmurray Heath. I'm president and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. We are the world's leading advocacy organization, representing over 1,000 biotechnology companies, 95% of whom are small companies. My background is I'm an MD PhD. My PhD is in molecular immunology. My medical training is in pediatrics. And I've worked on Capitol Hill. I've been Associate Center Director for Science in the Center for Devices at FDA, and worked at Johnson & Johnson as a leader for regulatory and clinical. So I can speak to our company's united effort to try to produce new vaccines, antivirals, and therapeutics for COVID, as well as some of the pathways that they've had to face navigating the FDA and trying to work with communities to make sure we have good representation in the clinical trials.
Thank you so much. Now let's get to this discussion. I see we have questions coming in already. I would like to ask Dr. Corbett the first question, because it comes in about vaccine development. How are they developed? How do they work? And one question that we have, please explain in layman's term, they're saying, how is it that phase 2 and phase 3 occurs simultaneously? And I think it may be important to talk about the phases of development. Thank you.
Absolutely. So there are the phases of vaccine development, or really any drug development. Well, they really start in the preclinical phase, which is not a clinical phase, but it is when the vaccine is tested in animals, and there gets to be a really broad understanding about how it might be able to be translated into a human. So this happened in mice and in monkeys for the COVID-19 vaccines. And then the phase 1 clinical trials is a very small clinical trial, usually around 50 people, where information on safety is largely assessed. But there are some secondary endpoints on how the vaccine elicits immune responses. And then from there, a phase 2 clinical trial happens where about 500 people are enrolled, and you get more nitty-gritty about the doses of the vaccine and more information about the safety and immune responses. And then finally is the phase 3 clinical trials, where upwards of 50, 60,000 people, but for many of the vaccines that are being developed, at least in the US, it's around 30 or 40,000 people that are enrolled in these phase 3 clinical trials. And the real question in those trials is, does the vaccine work? Does the vaccine work at preventing disease? In this particular case, COVID-19 disease. And so the way that this so-called warp speed, as it's called in the media, but rapid development of these vaccines is working, is that these phases have been compressed to a point that at each phase, there's a checkpoint that allows for the next phase to start. So simultaneously, all of the trials can be working at the same time. So the checkpoints in the preclinical phase was really, are you eliciting an immune response? Can you see that the vaccine is working in animals? And then from there, from the phase ones, the checkpoint is the vaccine safe, at least acutely so? And then from there, the phase two, the checkpoint is it safe in a large amount of people? And then a phase three can start as all of these data are coming in to really inform how the phase three may start. And so these things are happening simultaneously, but with really strategic checkpoints that the FDA has laid out. And generally speaking, this sometimes these phases actually take years. For example, the phase one actually started, for example, in March, and it is a year-long trial. So people are still being monitored from the phase one along the way as even the phase three is continuing. So a lot of people say you don't necessarily have long-term data, but we do at least have through month 7 at this point from 45 people that were vaccinated back in March with some of the experimental in the experimental trials. And so it's a simultaneous effort, but at each point there are checkpoints that are regulated by the FDA, and data is looked at closely from various different angles, and experts really understand how the vaccine data might inform the next phase of the clinical trial.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Brown.
Yes, I can't see.
Oh, it's Dr. Hildreth.
Oh, yes, good.
Can I just add a couple of points?
Please. I was going to ask you the next question, but go right ahead.
One of the things that needs to be pointed out about the speed of this is that there was a pre-existing infrastructure for HIV vaccines, and it's called the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. That network was asked to pivot to COVID-19 vaccine work. So this pre-existing infrastructure did a great deal to accelerate the process. Let me also point out that one of the things we have going for us, the technology being applied to the COVID-19 vaccine is really rather amazing. And people should keep in mind that the genome of the virus was published in January. And here we are in November, literally about to give EUA approvals to 2 vaccines. And the extraordinary speed is really related to 2 things, the technology and the pre-existing infrastructure that was asked to pivot to COVID-19. So it may seem like it's amazing, it is amazing, but those are the 2 reasons I think why we've achieved this in such a short period of time.
Thank you. Well, the question that was sort of related to that is the vaccine development process for COVID-19 the same as for other vaccines that we've developed? And so again, you were addressing some of that. Let me ask both Dr. Hildreth and Dr. Mcmurray Heath, when you talk about the different platforms and whether it's a monoclonal antibody or a vaccine, can you address how the different platforms aid in streamlining the research and development process?
So, with everything, I'll make
go ahead, Dr.
point, and I'll let you have it, Dr. Mcmurray Heath. The 2 vaccines that have reached this stage are exciting for one reason. They represent a new technology called messenger RNA. There's a central dogma in biology that genes encode proteins, but there's an intermediate called messenger RNA. The messenger RNA then becomes a working template to produce the protein. So most vaccines involve either viral proteins or inactivated or pieces of the virus. In this case, we're giving the person messenger RNA that encodes the protein. The messenger RNA gets taken up by cells in our bodies. Our cells then make the viral proteins, and then the immune system responds to it. What's so exciting about this is this technology will probably be adaptable to a whole range of viruses and other kinds of things to which vaccines need to be made. This also accounts for some of the speed that we're seeing, because mRNAs can be developed in a very short period of time compared to recombinant proteins. and inactivated viruses and recombinant viruses. So I'm excited because we have a totally new platform for vaccines that might accelerate the process in the future as well. And to me, that's very exciting.
Okay.
I would just agree. It's a very exciting time. And, you know, one of the things to think about is that it's important to get the proteins from the COVID virus into the human body so that it can start eliciting an immune response. Now, there's many different ways to do that. In our traditional flu vaccine, where you think about, oh, we need to grow it in these huge facilities that take a very long time to generate the proteins. That in that type of vaccine, you're actually delivering the fully assembled protein from flu into the human body, usually with adjuvant, to try to irritate the immune response and elicit a strong response. What we're seeing now with COVID is not just protein-based vaccines, but also vector-based vaccines that are using, for example, a cold virus, adenovirus, to deliver a gene from the COVID virus into the human body to then start replicating and produce enough protein to elicit immune response. And we also have these mRNA-based vaccines, which are really just skipping a step and delivering the messenger RNA directly into the human body. So one of the great hopes of the mRNA vaccines is that perhaps we'll need less adjuvant to elicit a strong immune response. And this is incredibly important, particularly for immunocompromised patients such as the elderly, where it's sometimes difficult to get a strong immune response in response to a vaccine. Now, you also mentioned monoclonal antibodies. Now, those are more being used in the therapeutic setting rather than the vaccine setting. So those will be available for patients after you've become infected with COVID and you're trying to mount your own immune response. Those could aid you in producing that immune response by offering you exogenous antibodies to help fend off the virus.
Thank you. Dr. Tuckson, how do you determine the safety and efficacy of a COVID-19 vaccine?
Well, what's of course happening now as we go through the process of these clinical trials is that we are, watching very carefully. People are already reporting the major side effects at this point have to do with just the site of injection and the traditional things that you would expect in terms of sore arms and so forth. One of the things that is important as physicians think about counseling their patients about concern for this is just as you notice that when you have the immune system kick in and becomes effective, that does produce certain sensations in the body. And so we need to make sure that as we're counseling our patients, that we're letting them know that an immune system that is beginning to function intensely may cause some different symptoms and effects and so forth, but that those are not things to be concerned about. But overall, I think that the real answer to this question will really lie as we continue to go through the process of the clinical trials. One of the things that I think a lot of people fail to understand in the public, and physicians will have to counsel their patients, is that we still, by and large, have not seen the data fully, and that the trials are continuing. While we have great evidence and great reason, as all of our colleagues have said, to be excited, we still, though, need to know that there is a long way to go. Lastly, I would comment that on the safety profile, one of the most important roles that our audience will have will be in the surveillance after the vaccines are administered. And that surveillance process will be ongoing for quite a while so that we will know about these side effects. And I think that our community of physicians will need to be very well prepared to participate in that post-marketing surveillance activity, which is really where we'll get most of our answers.
Okay. Well, I see that there's lots of questions coming in the box. Here's one. I've heard that the MCR5 is included in not only a COVID-19 vaccine, but in other vaccines. Can you talk about the ingredients and the safety of the vaccines? And there's a corollary to that that says the MRC5 is reported to be developed from lung tissue of aborted male tissues. So I think that's one for Dr. Corbett and Dr. Hildreth. And if the other panelists want to chime in, please do.
Dr. Hildreth, I'll let you take it.
I think they're referring to the type of cells that are cultured to produce components of, I may be mistaken, but Oftentimes when we do these kinds of things, we have to produce certain components in cell lines that are immortalized, that are growing culture. And I believe that MRC5 is one of those cells, and that's not uncommon. It doesn't represent any particular threat of causing harm or danger. It's just part of the process of producing some of the components that need to be incorporated into the vaccine. We've used that cell line many times in my own laboratory when we do some studies, certain studies with HIV. If I'm getting it correct, if that's what they're referring to.
Thank you. Yes. Dr. Wallace, why is diversity in the vaccine clinical trials important?
This is a interesting question that gets asked a lot, and I'm sure my other panelists fellow panelists will have other thoughts as well. But certainly I think it's important because we want to ensure that our communities are involved in the studies and involved in helping to determine whether or not any vaccine that may be approved also works for our communities. And I think it's also important that we look at diversity because, as we know, and as you talked about, Dr. Brown, specific communities are bearing the burden of COVID-19 cases in this country and in international settings as well. And so thinking about how increasing or ensuring that those communities also have access to participating in the trials to really help to address the burden that communities are experiencing. And, you know, for this conversation, I will say specifically, we're talking about Black communities. So Black communities are bearing the burden of COVID-19, in part because of other health conditions that are underlying as a result of systemic racism and other issues. So I think it's really important that we consider how engagement in clinical trials would benefit all communities.
Thank you very, very much for your attention to this video. I just want to follow up and just say that though this was a presentation of a video from blackdoctors.org, I also want to make sure that we are clear and that we know that Black communities, Hispanic, Latinx communities, American Indian, Alaskan Native communities have been disproportionately affected by this virus. I would like to say that we certainly heard from the Black doctors who have been intricately involved in the development of the vaccine and the clinical trials. Again, information we don't get from mainstream media. Now I'd like to turn over this portion of the town hall to Dr. Cerise Hunt, who will lead the Real Talk discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Richards. Good evening, and we're so thrilled that you're here today. And I just want to remind folks, we see that the questions are coming into the Q&A, and we have earmarked like the last segment of the event today, the town hall, for that interactive discussion. So we will get to as many questions as we can with about 400 participants. So I just want to let everyone be aware. We're going to transition to our first panel discussion. And we're going to talk about vaccine hesitancy in Black and Brown communities. You know, is it real? And so I want to welcome our esteemed panelists, and if they could go ahead and turn their cameras on. And we will begin by asking each panelist to introduce themselves, because we got some super phenomenal people that are doing some phenomenal work within communities. And please share with us the work that you're doing in community as well. So if we can go ahead and start with introductions. We'll start with Dr. Rhonda.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Cerise. Thank you, Dr. Richards, for this forum. I am Dr. Rhonda Coleman. I'm a doctor of acupuncture and oriental medicine. And the work that I do is in part private clinical work, treating patients with acupuncture and herbal medicine, and then part advocacy. I do a lot of community activism around health and equity in health. I am a board member and also co-chair of our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee for Integrative Medicine for the Underserved. That's a national organization that works to improve health equity. I am vice president of the Black Acupuncturist Association, and I am also chair of now Senator James Coleman here in Colorado's health cabinet, health, mental health, and insurance health cabinet. So I do a lot of work around helping educate people. I do a lot of listening to community and their concerns, and I'm constantly studying and learning myself. And so I guess that's part of why I've been invited to share my thoughts here, and I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ivanich.
Yes, thank you so much for having me be part of this wonderful discussion. My name is Dr. Jared Ivanich. I'm a member of the Metlakatla Indian community in Southeast Alaska. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado School of Public Health in the Centers for American Indian and Alaska Native Health. The majority of my research meets at the intersections of social network analysis, prevention science, and substance use prevention among youth. And since this pandemic has started, I've been involved quite heavily with a lot of COVID-related research around relationships and contact tracing, and then also advocacy around tribal nations and their data around COVID reporting, and working with my previous affiliation at Johns Hopkins University to make sure that those voices are heard and that data is being tracked accurately.
Thank you. Dr. Richardson.
Yes, I'm Dr. Terry Richardson. I'm currently an internal medicine physician at Kaiser Permanente, but I had my baptism at the Eastside Health Clinic as part of Denver Health. I was there for 17 years, and they did baptize me, and they made me into the community doctor that I am today. And I'm most proud about that. I grew up in Northeast Denver. I came back home. I started on the East Side, and I'm still working at the East Clinic at Kaiser. And I just love my people and love to try to learn and help educate and make sure we get all that we need to get out of health.
Thank you. Dr. Oging.
Yes, thank you, Cerise, and thank you, Regina, for inviting me. I'm originally from Mexico. I'm a pulmonologist, and I work here at the Anschutz Medical Center. I treat patients with Covet in the ICU, and I also work at the Latino Research and Policy Center, where we do a lot of outreach, education, and policy with issues that specifically relate to health in Latino communities in Colorado and Denver.
Okay, so thank you. So just to get this discussion going, because we're supposed to have real talk, y'all. So I want to just make sure we're having this real talk. Word on the street that there's some hesitancy within Black and Brown communities about this whole COVID vaccine. And when we talk about vaccine hesitancy, that refers to the delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccination despite the availability of vaccination services. So my first question to you all are, what factors in the communities you serve can influence vaccine hesitancy? So I don't know who wants to kick us off.
I'll jump in if that's okay. So I think serving mostly American Indian and Alaska Native communities, as many of you likely know, there is a strong history of distrust between the government and medical officials, and I think that that's rooted in a lot of history that we could spend a long time reviewing, but we'll kind of just hit the highlights. And something that I really wanted to highlight was, in as early or as recently as the 1970s and 60s, there was a vast movement to sterilize American Indian and Alaska Native women without their knowledge. And so I just pulled up just one quick data point for those of you that like data like myself. So looking at census data from 1970, the American Indian, Alaskan Native rates of birth or number of children was 3.29 in the 1970 census. Compare that to 1980, where it was 1.3. So it's estimated that 1 in 4 Native women were sterilized, often against their will and often without their knowledge, when they would go in for routine access to care at the IHS facilities, which are government run. And I know that there's been a history around that, but I think that sort of behavior and that sort of history, as early or as recently as the 70s, that's, my mom was alive in 1970, and many of the folks on this call were alive in 1970. So I think that there's a real hesitancy to really just fully engage and want to participate in early adoption of medical treatment and medical advancement, because we don't know if this was made for and has been approved and verified by people that are trusted from Native communities. And there's a host of other issues that we could talk about, but succinctly, I think that is one very salient aspect, or one salient example specific to Native communities that I thought would really bear some light to why there's some hesitancy around vaccination right now.
Thank you. Dr. Coleman, what are your thoughts?
So the people that I see in clinic are typically people that prefer a more natural route to health. They prefer to be more preventive than reactionary in their medical approach. And so they are coming in for maintenance. They are coming in for an alternative to prescription drugs. They're coming in sometimes because prescription drugs didn't work. They're coming in because of previous injuries, or because of family members who have had injuries, whether they be emotional injuries or actual physical injuries, and sometimes even chemical injuries from the medical field, from allopathic medicine. And so oftentimes these are people that have already, been bruised or harmed in some way. And so they don't have a trust because of experiential reasons. There are a few that have hesitancy because of, historical reports of injury to the Black community on a larger scale. And many of them recognize that it goes beyond the Tuskegee Institute, which is often put out there as like, that one time that something bad happened. People are very well aware that beyond Tuskegee and previous to Tuskegee, that there were assaults against the Black community by the medical community. And if I add my own piece to it, it's very hard for me to believe that because my medicine is based on patterns, that following a pattern of behavior, that behavior has suddenly changed. And furthermore, that a system of mistreatment and a system of racism has suddenly changed, because that would make medicine the only system and the only area where we've eradicated racism and where we have finally begun to care about, people of color and Black people specifically, while all other systems still, are not in support of us.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Dr. Oging, what are your thoughts?
Yes, these are excellent comments. One of the things I encounter a lot in seeing patients when talking to vaccines, especially Hispanic patients, is that, they're sort of caught on the message on the media that this is like an overwhelmingly rapidly development for a vaccine. Like it's really nothing in the history. Vaccines take 5 to 10 years to develop, and these things were developed in less than a year. So people are like hesitant, like there's not enough experience, there's not enough time, I want to wait a little bit more. And indeed, the Washington Post put out a survey, a national survey around December, and found that 14% of Black people trusted that the vaccine will be safe, and only 18% trusted that it would be effective in shielding them from the coronavirus. So a little bit higher among Latinos, 30%, 34% to 40% trusting safety. But the good news, Cerise, is that there's been a lot of social media uptake. Everybody's putting out pictures of getting vaccinated and so on. And so if you look at the rates of people willing to be vaccinated, for example, in non-white population, in the US in July, 72% people saying that they were, not going to do it. And then that dropped to 40, and that's around 50%. So the uptake about people wanting to do it is increasing. And I think we need to really take advantage of that momentum and continue to send a positive message.
Thank you. Dr. Richardson, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts, so I did my own mini polls before the vaccine came out to see who would be willing to get this vaccine. And it was interesting. I also looked at the Pew Research Center in November, did a study to see who would be willing to get the vaccine. About 80% of Asians that took the survey said they would get the vaccine. Only about 42% of Black people said they would get the vaccine. And that was the lowest percentage because whites and Latino were around 60%. And when Dr. Terry did her survey, it was about 52% said they would get it. And I never twist my patient's arm, so this was real. And so I wanted to know, why are people not willing to get it? Those who are not willing to get it, because of course there are some that are willing to get it, and there's no problem. We're not one group. We don't all think the same way. So some people want to get it, some people don't want to get it, and some people are in the middle. So I said to the people who didn't want to get it, what are your concerns? And I read about this in the literature too. What are your concerns? And there's all kinds of things out on the internet, like a chip will be injected into people, that there weren't people of color in these clinical trials, so we don't know how it works for us. And that actually was not true. It's about 10% of these clinical trial participants were Black, which is really higher than you've seen in the past. But overwhelmingly, what came up most was Tuskegee, Tuskegee, Tuskegee. That was supposed to be a 3-month study, and the experiment went on for 40 years. Some even Black doctors have said, why can't Black people just get over it and realize it's a different day? Well, you don't forget 40 years of not being treated. There's myths out there that these men were injected. They were not injected with syphilis. They had syphilis. They just were not treated. So there's lots of myth around that. If the government could participate in that way for 40 years, like Dr. Coleman was saying, how do we know that things have changed? And so you have to educate people about these are different times, but that's real. That's what happened to Black people in America from the 30s to 1972. Now let me sit down for a minute.
Okay. So being responsive, when we talk about being culturally responsive and all those words that we put and say that we're going to do, we have to take this all into consideration when we engage with community, because this is the reality. History has played out and has been brought into this discourse. So then my next question is, well, how do we address vaccine hesitancy within Black and Brown communities? Like, what needs to be done?
I will speak particularly for the Hispanic and Latino community. I think we have to have a very cultural, sensitive, and directed message by people and organizations that the community trusts. The CDPHE has a lot of good information directed towards the Latino community in Denver, but there's a lot of hesitance that relates to the current political environment, and people are afraid of really coming out, especially those that are not documented. So I think we have to really reinforce the message that, one, there's right now enough thousands of people that have been vaccinated and the vaccine is safe and effective, but that voice would only be trusted by the Hispanic community if it comes from people that they trust. So it has to be a message delivered by communities, partners, and leaders in the community that can really have an impact. So I think that's one way that we can move this forward.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I didn't say this, but, I grew up on the East Side and knew Dr. Terry. So when we talk about a trusted physician, it's Terry. That's who we ask. And trust me, I asked Terry myself. I was like, Terry, what's your thoughts about, am I telling the truth, Terry? I called you, we had a conversation, because she's trusted. So that notion of trust is important, ensuring that folks, that's why, you know, so I just want to, I appreciate you stating that, because it's very important about when we're engaging with community. How are you trusted, you know, and who are those leaders within the community that are trusted by our community members, that they would say, okay, if Dr. Terry says it, I'm down with it. I'm down for the cause. I might get my shot because Dr. Terry got her shot and showed us that information. So just want to throw that. What are your thoughts, Dr. Coleman?
Cerise, I was going to ride right off of what you were saying there, because
cool.
For me, I was on a conference call earlier this week, and we were having a really frank and good discussion. But then we were kind of having a cultural moment when we were saying, Dr. Kizmikia Corbett. I mean, that is a young Black woman that helped develop this vaccine, the Moderna vaccine. That made me start feeling like, hey, I can start talking about this vaccine and why it's important, because people that look like us, when you look at that panel, the video that we looked at, those are trusted resources. So I got to be like a lay person and say, wow, I can learn from these people. They look like me, and it's very cultural. They're saying the things that people need to hear, and so they can start developing a trust that this vaccine could be safe and get us back to a different place. But you have to have those trusted messengers. You can't send in what people may see as the devil. You have to send in the trusted messengers, and the messengers have to be educated. And then we have to take that and educate in a way that our people can understand and hear the message.
Absolutely. A way they can hear and understand. So there's some common themes. Okay, who's next? We want to jump in?
I'll go. First, I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge the film that the video that the Black doctors put out. I thought it was very well done, and it was really nice to see those faces up there. I think it was very impressive, the work that they've done. As far as the trust question goes, I think that a lot needs to go, a lot more than just putting Black faces in top position needs to go into building trust. I think that there's a lot of misconception that the people that are hesitant are people that are less educated than the doctors and the scientists and the researchers and all those people are. And that's not necessarily the case. I can follow research very well. I would be considered educated, and I am not planning to get the vaccine, in case that wasn't clear for everybody listening. But I like to use analogies, so please forgive me. But at the end of slavery, for example, I don't think anyone would expect that the enslaved people suddenly believe that they would get fair treatment, get jobs, like that things would ultimately change because slavery ended. Even 40 years later, there might not be that expectation. So we're talking about incidences that are within the lifetime of people that are still alive, of attacks and assaults on Black and brown bodies by the medical field. So I think that there needs to be more than just Black scientists involved and Black doctors getting vaccinated and Black representatives pushing for this virus to come into our community to build that level of trust. I think there needs to be a lot of more system level changes. And for me, and for many of the people that I've spoken with that study in the same way that I study, we recognize that there's a foundational issue. So our medical establishment as it is based on white supremacist and elitist values. The whole medical education system is based in white supremacist views. If you go back to 1910 and the William Flexner report and how that changed the field of medicine, changed the schools that existed, changed how we determine whether something works or doesn't work, the efficacy of things, changed the method of proving that things work or didn't work. It's all very elitist. It's all very exclusionary to more traditional practices, which have their own relevancy. And medicine has become this responsive, disease-focused thing that some people just don't buy into yet. And so I think it goes beyond placement of people in positions of power to build that trust.
You're muted.
I know. Thank you, Dr. Coleman. And addressing the structural racism and the inequities that has continued, historical inequities that have been going on for centuries within these communities. So I appreciate your comment and your acknowledgement. So knowing that it's just not enough to have that Black or brown face, it's making sure that inward our organizations, we're dismantling the structures and rebuilding, really calling out white supremacies in practice and policies and procedures in every area. So thank you, Dr. Ivanich.
Yeah, I appreciate what my colleagues on the phone call have already said, and I'm excited to hear what the emerging leaders have to say. So I'll try to keep it brief, but something that is really informative and helpful for Native community is the messaging, especially on tribal lands and how these things get delivered. And so we see a huge effort being made right now to take the materials that are being presented from the medical professionals and really boil that down into a way, and through images, arts, and language, be able to re-message that back to communities in a way that they understand and that resonates with their community. And so I think, oftentimes the most sacred of our communities are our elders. And so there's a lot of effort going on right now to make sure that our elders are protected, and what this vaccine can do to help protect and restore and maintain those knowledge keepers in our communities. And so even right now in some communities like the Oglala Sioux tribe, they are getting first in line. Those folks that not only are elders but are language keepers, they are getting first priority, and that signals to a lot of other people that this can be trusted and that this is something worth doing if it is going to protect our most sacred and is being promoted by our leaders in the community to protect them. There is a certain level of trust that goes into that. So I think the messaging and the understanding around that is extremely critical. And then also just the transparency that we've all been alluding to is really, how is this message being received, and what does that process look like? So thanks, I appreciate it.
Okay. So I want to thank my panelists. We're going to hear back from you all at our Q&A, and we're going to transition because we have another esteemed panel of emerging leaders who turn their cameras on. And what we really want to do, and I want to give, similar to the last panel, I want to give each of you a moment to introduce yourselves and your connection within the community. So why don't we start with Stephanie?
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Onyeachiwagu. I am originally from Aurora, Colorado. So grew up here, was born here, raised here, and I am a medical student at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. I'm also pursuing my master's in public health from Harvard University. And my ties to the community are long and wide, not only just being a part of the Colorado community, the Black community here, but also representing the Colorado community on the national scale. I'm on the National Board of Directors for the Student National Medical Association, and that is an organization that has been built to support students of color and diversify the face of medicine so that we have more people who look like us going into the medical field and going into research and going into science. So, and I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you, Stephanie. Vicky, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Vicky Garza, or Vicky Garza. It's new, I'm still getting used to it. I am a dual master student at the School of Social Work at the University of Denver, and also a public health master student at here at CU Anschutz. I am currently working as a resource navigator at CLARO, the Colorado Latino Leadership Advocacy Research Organization, and also focusing my studies in public health on Latino health.
Thank you, Vicky. Kalia, welcome.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kalia Kabir. I am currently a racial equity consultant with Forever Riot LLC. And I'll just say, because I've been typing in the comments, but we are actually working and launching a project on myths and misconceptions. So some myth busting work around COVID-19 in BIPOC communities. We use like a racial equity approach to really make it community specific. So I've told folks, if people need that information about myths as we're having that conversation, drop your email and I'll send it to you all. I am also from Denver. And I am a part of the program management team of a new program from Colorado Black Health Collaborative, shout out to them, called Her Health, Her Truth, that's focusing on Black women's health. So I would say that I've been in community in a few different facets. I'm so excited to have this conversation, and I'm loving the dialogue that we're already having in the Q&A section.
Thank you all. So I'm glad I can feel the energy. So my first question to you all are, what are your reactions to all that we've discussed thus far? The video, the panel discussion, the chat that's going on, so what are your initial thoughts? Stephanie, do you want to kick us off?
I'll let Vicky go. She unmuted herself.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I think the part that resonates the most with me is the discussion that the providers had about trust. I think ultimately that's what it comes down to in all of our communities, in really saying like, hey, we need to be here for the people who look like us. And I think that's part of the in the video that Dr. Brown was discussing, is that Black providers have died a lot more than other providers. And the question that comes up for me is like, well, why is that? Is that because those are the people who are running to, the way you said, Cerise, you went to Dr. Terry to say, hey, what's going on? Is that the people who are running to because the populations of Black and Brown people are more sick and are more exposed to COVID-19 than other folks? So they're running to people who they trust, they're running to people who they know. And that potential exposure, I think, is being noted with those deaths. So I think some of those questions that come up are super relevant. And it's also another question of like, well, are our Black and Brown providers serving these communities that we see are underserved more so than other providers? And is that why they're dying more? So I think just a lot of questions come up when we're talking about this. And that unfortunate piece of like, well, who else are people going to go to if that's the only people that they feel comfortable with?
Right. Thank you, Vicky. Okay, I'll leave it up to Stephanie or Kalia, whoever wants to go next.
I think I can jump in with my reactions about the conversation that we have been having. And one thing that I think resonates with me is the difference between, or when we talk about the African-American community or any marginalized communities, trust in the medical system or trust in the vaccine or trust in whatever. I think it's important that we kind of flip that conversation and say, it's not that we distrust and it's not that we distrust the medical society, it's that the medical field has created an abundance of atrocities against our communities. So putting the onus on the medical field and not on the people who are victims to the horrendous activities of the medical field. And I completely understand why people would be hesitant to take the vaccine from a field that has over and over and over again shown us that they don't care about us. Even in today's news, we talk about Black maternal mortality and all of the different things that are disproportionately affecting our communities. Why should we trust the medical community? But one thing I will say is, even if I'm a part of the medical community, I'm also a part of the Black community. And I know that I specifically, and there's so many people out there who are working against those atrocities. There are some things in place, systemic things in place that are working against those atrocities. They're not perfect yet. There's still so much work to be done. However, I personally believe in science, and I believe in the vaccine, and I believe in that we can move past COVID. And I think that there's just a lot of things that need to happen simultaneously, both trust, both reconciliation on the behalf of the medical community, and uptake of the vaccine so that we can get rid of COVID in our communities.
Hey, Stephanie. what you thinking?
I really appreciate what Stephanie said about how we need to have a multi-layered approach to this. And I say that because someone in the comments wrote something that I thought was very important for the Black community to really unpack. And let me see. They said, I am a 60-year-old Black male. I was 50% pro to receive a vaccination over summer 2020. Today, I am 99% pro because of questions my doctor asked. I have a choice, one of the two V's, vaccine or ventilator. I know to choose vaccine. And so I bring up this point because I think we're having a real talk, so we can be real about the realities for Black folks, Indigenous folks, and Latinx folks. We're in Denver, so I'll give the context of Denver. Right now, our Latinx folks are being hit the hardest, right? So if we are saying that we don't want to get the vaccine, is the option trying to fend with death? Like, really, what are we really talking about when we are having this vaccine conversation? And how do we get folks to see? And I don't want to use fear tactics, but I think we've lost folks. Some of us have lost family members. We're losing doctors and nurses. So how do we really frame that in the way that Stephanie said, of like, we have to have some reconciliation. We have to have some accountability, but we also have to have some trust as well for us to get to a better place. I don't want to is far. I hope we accept that. Y'all see what's happening around us, but how do we get to a better place?
Thank you, Kalia. So getting to a better place. Are there any thoughts to what Kalia just stated?
I mean, I like that statement. Which V do you want? The vaccine or the ventilator? And I think that's a really, that's a realistic comment that people wouldn't necessarily see. I think there's that concern, that hesitancy that was discussed earlier that comes up as opposed to what might be the end goal here. So I think that's really significant that the gentleman shared that.
So how do we move forward? You know, as a community, like what's next? I mean, you all are emerging leaders. Y'all are in the trenches along with us. I mean, what do you all think needs to be done in order for us to move forward?
I mean, I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead, Stephanie. No, your turn.
Yeah, I'll talk specifically about what I believe needs to happen in regards to the COVID vaccine. And I think the medical community has an opportunity to show historically marginalized communities that they are important, right? We're talking about, right now, the vaccine is out, but we haven't really discussed how it's being distributed and if it's being distributed equitably. So I think one thing that we need to think about and what we need to do moving forward is making sure that those vaccines are getting to the communities that need it, and not just saying, oh, we're gonna put 50 vaccines here, 50 vaccines here, and making sure that it's equal across everybody else. We need to make sure that these vaccines are distributed equitably amongst the people who need it the most, the people who are dying from this disease the most, the people who are spreading the disease the most. And to be honest, that hasn't been happening. The vaccine, when we look at where the vaccine is going, once it hits, we look at the medical providers, we're getting it first, and then elderly populations and so on and so forth. But once the vaccine hits the general population, how are the vaccines going to be distributed? Are they going to go to the health clinics in communities of color? Are they going to go to the rich white clinics that all the rich people get to go to? We need to be looking at that. And I think when it comes to just the coronavirus and the COVID vaccine, that's one next step that we can look at, and the next most tangible thing that we can do to make sure that there is trust in the community, or there is trust in the medical field, is making sure we are distributing resources equitably.
And that word equity, we all throw out that word equity. And we all know in theory what equity is, but we also know if we don't apply it to practice, it's just rhetoric. So it's moving past being performative, because all of us we're about equity, we're about all of these different things. But if we're not conducting our work through an equity lens, it's going to continue to perpetuate the same inequities. And so I think it's things that we know already. We're just not practicing because we're not choosing to practice. And so I just want to, we have an opportunity to make that choice and truly advance equity as we're thinking about COVID-19. I know, Vicky, I jumped in, so sorry.
That's okay. I jumped in too. It makes me think with the equity piece, it makes me think about the way we are rolling out. I know we have the piece where the 70 and older, the elderly are receiving this vaccine. However, the Latino population has a lot of mixed generation homes. So is that really a situation? And I think all of our populations really have that distribution where grandparents are helping out and they live in the home. And when they're receiving this vaccine, is that still providing an opportunity of safety for them to have that? Like, is it more functional for the family to get this? And I get where these policies are coming from and looking at both sides, like, would it be more effective if the whole family got it? These are just questions that come up to me because that happens, because there are these families and it's kind of a different stance than what the general population might experience. I think another situation that came up with this is we have these essential workers who are also going to be receiving this vaccine. And I think in an experience that came up recently with one of my coworkers, just doing some research, they were indicated that they had to provide proof of their essential work. Well, if you're an undocumented person, in my experience in working with undocumented people, they didn't even want to provide me a letter of documentation saying I work here for a discount for their medical services. So to ask someone to provide proof of where you work so you can receive this, it's really going to be limiting, and that distrust comes back up again of like, why do you want to know? Where is this coming? I might not get this vaccine, even though it's free, even though I know where I can get it. So I think just some of those concerns and the policies that come up when we are providing this information is really real to our populations. So moving forward, maybe we look at changing that.
Thank you, Vicky.
I was just going to say that I think there's a lot of excitement and hype right now about getting the vaccine, but I think what Stephanie said is very important, that there is a very good possibility, and to Dr. Rhonda's point and what we've been talking about, that our communities may not get this vaccine anytime soon. And with that being said, I think we have to be honest about the fact that just because certain folks are getting the vaccine doesn't mean that we're safe to start moving differently than we have been. And that our communities, we need to be taking safety precautions still to kind of mitigate some of the loss that we've had. So I think really having some community-based conversations, because I'll be honest, I thought the video that we watched was a little challenging to understand. I'm not in the medical field, so a lot of that terminology, I do have a degree and so on and so forth, but if I can't understand it, then I don't know what any of that means. And I think we need to get to the point of like, what does it mean that, I don't know, some strand is in the vaccine? Like, what does that really mean? So we can start to unpack that so we're ready to make a decision, because I think this conversation is about us making an informed decision, not being pressured to go one way or the other. So that's really kind of what was coming up for me.
Okay, thank you. Well, are there any final thoughts before we transition to the Q&A? Okay, I want to thank you all. I know we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. So at this point, I'm going to invite all of our panelists to turn their cameras on, and we will jump into the Q&A. And I just want to share that there was a question about resources, and can we provide a resource list? And yes, so for all the folks who have registered, you expect to receive an email in the upcoming week with resources. So we will get information to you about COVID-19 and share those resources. And so I'm going to turn it over to Josh and Josh Blake and Nathifa Miller to handle our Q&A. And I want to thank you both for agreeing to moderate the Q&A and keep us informed of the questions. So we'll hand it over to you all.
Of course. Thank you, Cerise. So we've seen a lot of questions about how the vaccine is being allocated. So I just want to ask the panelists, what are your thoughts on, like, a lot of people are thinking that the people who need it the most, being the people of color, are not getting it first. And so I've seen some stuff about rich people are getting it first. So if y'all could just talk about equity amongst the allocation.
So do we know how it's being distributed? Has anyone heard any process?
You know, and let me start there, people, because, you know, of course, I'm in a healthcare system. And let's start out by saying we have a limited supply. And this is a very dynamic process. Initially, the 70-year-olds were in phase 2, that they were shifted to another phase. The healthcare systems didn't even know they were being shifted to a earlier phase. And so the processes have been a problem. I really feel like there needed to be some type of national strategy. I mean, there's a lot of priority groups with this vaccine. It's the people of color, it's the people with chronic diseases. Sometimes there's some overlap there, but the processes that I've seen, I don't think they're great. I've heard things like the rich are getting it, but I've seen all kinds of people getting it. There are some processes, but they're not really standard. And once the vaccines were released from the feds, the states can pretty much do what they want. I know there's issues around the prison population, whether they should be in phase 1, whether they should be in phase never. And we talk about racism.
Heard some conversations.
Racism.
Yes.
So this is a tough issue, yet we have a limited supply. We have how many residents in Colorado? 7 million or something. We're getting 70,000 vaccines per week. And so we don't really right now have enough. If we had a great supply, that would be great. But I still think we need to lead with equity. Who's being impacted the most? From the numbers I've seen, it's the Latinx population in Colorado that's leading in every category at this point. At one point, it was African Americans, but now it's Latinx. So how do you make sure this vaccine is free? You do not have to be a US citizen. You do not have to be reported if you're not a citizen. So there's a lot of issues. We need better processes to get this out equitably.
And I'd like to just piggyback off that and highlight the importance that shows of having the right people at the table to make those decisions. Because as you mentioned, as that gets distributed to the states who are then making decisions, you know, a lot of tribal nations are sovereigns. And so they have that ability to then determine where those vaccines go. And so while I'm sure that there's a lot of frustration of the speed of vaccines in tribal nations, I'm still also hearing some very positive things coming out of some of the tribal communities because they're sitting at the table, trusted leaders determining who gets it and when and under what circumstances. And so they're really able to make localized prioritization of who gets it. And then that also then affects a lot of the other things we're talking about. But I think that, again, just highlights what you were saying, Dr. Richardson, about who's making that decision and are we being transparent? Because I don't know who sits on that board for Colorado. And maybe it's easy to find, but that hasn't been told to me, that hasn't been broadcast. And so I think there's a lot of efforts to be made around who are making those decisions and who holds the strings.
Cerise, if I can comment, because I think one of the previous panelists touched on this and Terry mentioned, and I think it's important to be clear, and I'm going to read it actually off the CDPH website. You know, cost will not be an obstacle to getting the vaccine for Coloradans. You know, public health will not be shared, information will not be shared to immigration or law enforcement agencies. CHP and private insurance are required to cover the cost of the COVID vaccine. Uninsured Coloradans will have access to free vaccines. You do not need to be a US citizen, and you will not need to prove lawful presence to get a COVID-19 vaccine in Colorado. So I think, you know, these are some of the important things that anybody can show up at some point when it becomes available, and and get it, and they don't need to show any documents whatsoever. They don't need to actually show proof that they're residents of Colorado.
Okay, so the next question is related to the high-risk individuals. Should they take Moderna vaccine or Pfizer? Is there any truth to this? And if so, what really is the difference? What is the difference?
I can comment. You know, as far as we know, the vaccines are pretty much they're equally effective. They're both greater than 90% efficacy, 95 efficacy. So I do not think that one is better than the other.
I would just add, I would agree with that also. It's really more in the freezer and refrigeration requirements of the two vaccines, where Pfizer is minus 112 degree Fahrenheit need. So that has to go to systems that have these super freezers, whereas Moderna is just regular refrigerator temperatures. So they're both mRNA technology. There's some other vaccines coming out, but these two are both mRNA. It doesn't matter which one you get, but you can't mix them. If you get Pfizer the first time, in 21 days, you need to get Pfizer again. If you get Moderna the first time, 28 days, you need to get it. I got Moderna, so I've got a couple more weeks to go back and get my vaccine.
Terry, thank you for clarifying that. I will also add that one of the things, and I don't think we talked about it, Cerise, before, that may produce some hesitancy in vaccine acceptance is anytime someone hears the word genetic, the people freak out tremendously, right? It's got to be bad for you. It's going to do something to your genes. I want to tell people that RNA only carries the information for your cells to make the protein. That's it. It cannot be incorporated into genome. It will not be part of your DNA. This is not DNA. So that, you see a lot of those things there's a lot of disinformation in the internet. These are safe products, and your cells use them to make protein, and that's about it.
Okay, great. Thank y'all. Y'all are really, this is like a real talk. I really appreciate it.
And speaking of real people, I wanted to I'm sorry, I want to interject here because this is like bubbling up in me. And I know Dr. Coleman didn't mean it like this, but I was not implying that people are not educated who don't want to get the vaccine. What I was referring to is and I talk to my patient about this all the time, is like, this is the first time in my life that I know as much as I do about a vaccine. And it has been very helpful to me when I'm sitting down talking to patients. They're like, I don't want this thing. I'm going to get a chip. It's going to do this. And I said, people I've read about, I've learned about, I watched videos. So I know so much about it. So I'm not saying that people are uneducated in general. I think people don't know about this vaccine because I didn't know. So I started doing the deeper research, and some people may not be that interested. I mean, it gets kind of mind-boggling, but I do think that people need to know how these things work and why it might be important so they can make a conscious decision. I don't believe that I need to tell anyone what they need to do. They're grown folks. I do believe you need information on how this was developed, who was involved with that, who had our back as Black people in the development and distribution and all the rest of this vaccine. So I just want to clarify, because people that know me, I'm not saying people are uneducated, but I was uneducated on this vaccine, and I had to come up to speed because people say, what do you know? And then are you going to take it? So I just want to throw that in.
I want to clarify that, Dr. Terry, I respect you so much. I've consulted with you on multiple occasions. There's nothing that I've said today that is directed at anyone that is on this panel. It is based on a generalization of what I have heard and what other people have shared. And there are a multitude of doctors that don't necessarily look like us, Dr. Terry, that get defensive when people do come with education, and they make determinations about the aptitude of people based on whether or not they have also been in medical school or have studied research as to whether or not they'll respect their position and their ability to study or come with questions either. So that was in no way directed. I've been accused of being too direct, so I would never say something in a passive way. If I was talking about anyone on this panel, I would say their names. I was not at all.
Josh, I think we're ready for the next question.
Yes, we're ready. So we talked a lot about trust, and someone's question is, trust is gained, not given. How did you gain the trust of the community members? Anybody can go first.
I'll touch on this one. I just had read this, so that's funny that you picked this one. I think that you have to be in community. And I think we as communal people, we trust the folks that we see, that we know their heart, that we know their intentions. Dr. Hunt spoke about Dr. Terry. I've been in community with Dr. Terry as well. And she is someone that we've seen over the years, that we trust, that we know. And I think you have to build the rapport with folks. There's really no shortcuts to that. And I'll let someone talk on the broader sense, but on the individual level, that's kind of what comes to mind.
I mean, I completely agree. I think trust is a very complicated process and it matures over time, and that's something that you cannot make it instantaneous. This is why you have to really get the right people with the right standing in the community.
I think acknowledging when you don't know something is really important to build that trust.
100%.
To indicate, like, you know what, I'm not sure, I'm gonna find out, or I'm gonna ask the right people, because I'm not the end all be all. I'm still learning, and I think that is definitely a factor in being able to provide to people that trust and being able to build that up for them. Because without that, then it's just like, okay, you said you knew this, and the one time you mess up, it's done and it's killed, and then that relationship is gone.
100%, Vicky.
I've found also that listening and letting people know that you're listening to them by being able to repeat what they're saying, meeting them where they are, and using language that they can understand all really helps to build trust. If you speak over someone's head or speak in a way that makes them feel like you don't respect them, or you think you know more, that can often keep a wall up. And so what I do to build trust is I speak in a way that the room understands, or if it's one-on-one, I speak in the way the person I'm talking to understands. I'm a cross-cultural, third culture person, so I grew up speaking multiple languages. My accent changes depending on who I'm speaking with, and all of those kinds of things are what create that comfort level to allow people to have trust.
And I think that's an interesting point, Rhonda, because, especially when, vaccines distribution comes from either federal organizations or academic centers, usually the approach is top down, right? It's like, I know what you need to do, and this is what you need to do. And so we need to really get over that model of doing things and really function at the level with people.
And I agree with Dr. Coleman saying, listening to people and hearing what they're saying, valuing what they say, and knowing that, hey, I'm there with you, being there in the community. How many times do you see your doctor out in the community? How many times do you see your doctor with rollers in their hair at Home Depot? That's how you build a trust, because I'm real, I'm a human being just like you. I have fears and frailties just like the rest.
And we see her in community. Dr. Terry being present is key, and present outside of a funding source. So we can't just be in community when our grant is in community. If I'm establishing a relationship, if I'm establishing a rapport, I'm in community and I sustain those relationships. So I think that that's what's critical in this type of work is the whole notion of, how do we form relationships that are authentic, that aren't in what's in it for me, just that one-sided aspect. So that would be my final thought.
I'm coming off. I'm coming off video and off mute, because y'all know, as a community social worker, but as a person in community, when I work with community, see my people in community, I'm knowing that they are going to be teaching me some things about their life, their world, their perspectives, their experiences. I'm not going in trying to tell, oftentimes I'm just Regina. Those titles, I appreciate them. We all know we worked hard for them, but I'm in community, I'm just Regina, period. And so I'm going in with an asset evidence-based approach. It doesn't matter what it may perceive to look like in terms of the built environment, in terms of people's socioeconomic status. It does not matter about if there are multi-generations living in a 2-bedroom home. I'm coming to learn. And part of learning is listening and being authentic.
I also wanted to add that being trustworthy in the community is also being able to advocate for the needs of the community and help dismantle the systems that oppress our communities. And that can be in the form of advocacy on the policy field and the health systems field, which is where I try and do most of my advocacy, but trying to make sure that the systems that are in place to perpetuate this distrust in our communities or oppression in our communities are dismantled piece by piece.
Good. Well, thank you. Y'all, we got some energy around this. I know that there's probably like, look, Natifa turned her camera on. It was like, it's time to go to the next question. Y'all got about 100. So keep it moving, y'all.
How about 100? So I'm going to apologize ahead of time. There's a theme that I'm seeing, so I'm going to roll this theme into, I hope, one question and then hand it back to Josh. But it's going to shift into more practical. So there's a theme. For example, someone shared that they had Bell's palsy and heard that there's been at least 7 cases of people getting it as a result of the vaccine. Is it safe to take? They're in the fear of being re-triggered. There's another question that's specific to this allergic reaction. You know, this myth or whatnot. So I'm gonna tell y'all, that's where I'm at, this allergic reaction. And if there's an allergic reaction, is there an antibody? So there's various questions regarding the theme of just a reaction to the vaccine. And if you can, touch upon the Johnson & Johnson vaccine coming out. I know this is sort of compounded, but it's combined. Johnson & Johnson vaccine coming out. Is it one shot? Why are there some that have 2 shots, 1 shot? And I know Dr. Richardson had touched upon that. Thank you.
You know, I will respond to the first one about the Bell's palsy. And the CDC has some information on their website about Bell's palsy. Their official statement right now is that we can't say that Bell's palsy was directly caused by the vaccine. Now, time will tell whether and people that don't know what Bell's palsy is, that's a paralysis of one side of your face. There's ways to differentiate that from a stroke, but paralysis of one side of your face. Even in the clinical trials, there were some people that had that occur. But in looking at and reviewing this, they said right now we can't say it's definitely connected to receiving the vaccine. Time will tell, more to come. And also, I have not heard that a person that's had Bell's palsy before shouldn't get the vaccine. There are very few people that they say should not get the vaccine, and that may be some people on certain chemotherapy regimens. Everyone else pretty much is eligible. They didn't do the trials in pregnant women, but they're still even saying it's probably okay in pregnant women. So I'll let a couple of other doctors respond on the Bell's palsy if they want, if they have more information. That's what I know as of, I think it was December 30th, that was the information from the CDC website on the Bell's palsy issue.
Any other responses? Did Terry cover? Are there any other responses? Or did Terry?
In the FIFA, I couldn't remember the other vaccine issues because there's about 4 different, they weren't really tied in together. I know somebody talked about Johnson & Johnson, but what were the other vaccine questions besides the Bell's palsy?
It was the Johnson & Johnson, but if you can touch upon side effects to unborn child, because you just mentioned that, and it was about any type of, if you had an allergic reaction, is there an antibiotic or whatnot that you're administered. And to be frank, I've read something about that also. So.
And I will comment on some of the allergic reactions. During the clinical trials, there was not any severe allergic reactions, but in the real world, there has been anaphylaxis, which is where your throat kind of closes up, your blood pressure drops, you can't breathe. Those kind of reactions have occurred to a small degree. Anyone administering these vaccines have an EpiPen, which is if someone does have a severe allergic reaction, that's medicine that they can give. And again, CDC has some guidance on who should not get the vaccine if they have severe allergic reactions. And really the most severe reaction, the anaphylaxis, they're recommending if you've had any problems with any of the ingredients of these vaccines that you should probably hold off in getting it. But if you have food allergies or bee sting allergies, you're okay to get this vaccine because they're watching people for 15 minutes anyway. So if you have drug allergies, bee sting allergies, you still can get the vaccine. But if you've had a severe allergic reaction to any of the components of the vaccine, you should hold off and definitely talk to your doctor. I'll leave comment for others.
No, I agree with you, with Dr. Richards. I mean, I think that any vaccine can cause allergic reactions. And this is the difference when you take a study that's been evaluated on a clinical trial that even though has 40, 50,000 people, and then you open it to hundreds of thousands of people, you're going to see more events. But I want people to, it's very easy to think on the events that happen and not so much, we don't focus enough on the denominator. What I mean is like, think about all the tens of thousands of people that are being vaccinated every day for a very few numbers of severe allergic reactions that can be treated. So while the media plays a lot of attention on these allergic reactions, the vaccine is very safe and the severe allergic reactions can be treated. If you're someone that has had anaphylactic reactions in the past, I would still discuss it with your physician and consider bringing an EpiPen, and I would still seriously consider taking the vaccination. In terms of the Johnson & Johnson, I just want to say it's been rolled out. The study evaluated both single and 2 shots. The data shows that a single shot produces very good, what's called immunogenic response and antibodies that neutralize the viruses, and the safety profile is similar in terms of side effects to these mRNA vaccines. I'm not exactly sure. Right now, there are larger trials going on. So with 1 or 2 doses, I'm not sure if the rollout is going to be with a single dose personally. But the vaccine is very effective.
So I think we're ready for the next question. Joss.
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of questions about what happens after you get the vaccine. And one I saw a lot was, can you still contract or transfer COVID-19 after receiving the full vaccine?
This is if I can take on, this is an excellent question for which we don't exactly know. There is a potential risk. I personally think it's going to be very, very low, that after you get vaccinated, you could have like what we call subclinical or very mild disease that you will not be aware of, but that you could still infect other people. Dr. Richardson, I don't know what you think, but I mean, the data is just not out. We don't know. This is why we're telling people after you vaccinate, you have to continue to social distance, wear your mask, and do all the regular things.
Yeah, and I think the verdict is still out because if you think about it, these clinical trials where larger numbers of people who receive the vaccine started in July and August. So there hasn't been enough time to answer these questions. So I agree with that. Time will tell, and we'll try to keep people up to date on what they find out as time goes on.
I've been involved in a lot of different conversations, especially on the new app Clubhouse, and the medical research community, as well as doctors that have been, I guess, on the front lines and giving the vaccine more and answering a lot more questions than I have on panels, are all saying that there's no evidence at this point that it's going to stop infection or transmission of the disease by getting the vaccine.
stop infection?
Like the ability to get COVID again. So getting the vaccine does not prevent you from being infected either a first time or again. And it also does not prevent you from transmitting the disease to other people.
Well,
in the vaccine, I mean.
The second part, we don't know. The first part, I think the studies clearly show that after even 10 days after receiving the first dose, even after the first dose of the mRNA, you have a completely flat line. If you compare the groups on the Pfizer vaccine, those that received there were probably 8 infections out of 18,000 people compared to a much larger number of people that received the placebo. So to me, I think that there's unequivocal data that the vaccines prevent infection and prevent severe infection, while they may not prevent necessarily the risk of transmitting the disease. That's, you could have a subclinical infection as we mentioned before, but I think the vaccines are highly effective.
And I do
wanted to jump in.
Sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to make a quick clarification. When we're talking about the efficacy of the vaccine, it's important to say what the vaccine is efficacious about or against, and the vaccine is effective in preventing you from getting the COVID disease. So if you get the vaccine, you are protected from getting COVID disease. Right. Does not mean that you are no longer infectious to other people. And when we say when you get the vaccine, does it protect from infection? We have to be specific about what we mean by the word infection. Does that mean you are protected from getting infected does that mean that you are protected from getting the disease, or does it mean that you're protected from getting the virus in your body? So we have to be very careful about the words that we use when we talk about what this vaccine is efficacious against.
Well, I mean, people tracked severe and mild infections, and the vaccine was effective in reducing both. But I completely agree with you. One of the things we don't know is how long the immunity lasts. There are studies out there that have been following people, showing good antibody production up to like 6 or 8 months after, so in people that were vaccinated initially, but we don't know. This may be something that we have to get vaccinated every year, just like the flu.
Yeah, and that was good discussion. I think that people do agree that this vaccine is going to prevent the severe infections, the severe cases of COVID infection. And that's what's causing the tension and stresses on the hospital systems when you get the severe disease. And so that's really going to be a good thing that those severe diseases are going to be prevented. The other thing about how long will this vaccine last, I've seen some recent studies where even people who were infected with COVID-19, they were following their natural immunity. And they were saying that even up to 8 months, they're seeing that some people still maintain their natural immunity. So I thought that was an interesting point too. So if this vaccine could be so good as your own natural immunity, that would be great. It'd be great if this can go beyond that. And I know that some feel that the vaccine provides more robust immunity than your natural immunity. And some people may argue about that, but at least that's what I've been reading.
Okay, I'm gonna throw out another theme. This is great stuff, and I suspect that down in the bottom of the Q&A, there's questions that have popped up about what you all just talked about. That it's not, I'm gonna use the word permanent because I thought it was, I never had to take it again. There's a question regarding if a person is taking immunosuppressants, is it convenient to get the vaccine? And so that lies into the theme also of any underlying issues that are specific to Black and Brown communities. Is that being addressed, that equitable piece? So I'm hoping that makes sense. I think there's a theme there, so someone can answer that.
I think especially people that are taking immunosuppressant drugs should be vaccinated. The question should be whether those individuals, because of the nature of their disease or the drugs that they're taking, will they or not mount to a sufficient antibody response? I think that's, we don't know, and many of those patients were excluded from the trial. So I recommended to all my patients that I consider to have their immune system at risk for infection. Remember that one misconception is that people think, oh, if I get the vaccine, I'll get sick. These vaccines cannot give you COVID. They cannot give you an infection. So from that point of view, they're totally safe. The question is where, if somebody's taking a lot of immunosuppressants, whether they would have a good response to the vaccines. That's a question to be answered, I think.
Yeah, that was a good response. And regarding some of the disease states that are particular to groups, particularly African Americans, like sickle cell anemia, sickle cell trait, lupus, diseases that affect people of color more, the National Medical Association have worked with the pharmaceutical companies to have them analyze the data that they have on those groups, because we don't have any answers per se. We are encouraging all groups that are willing, get the vaccine, even if they have those particular diseases, but there still needs to be more information provided on how the vaccine impacts those particular groups with those diseases.
Thank you, Joss.
I feel like we're in sync because every time you say my name, I turn my camera. So I saw a question about indigenous people. So I wanted to kind of tap Jared. Is it Jared? They were just asking, have you heard anything about how the vaccine is affecting indigenous people, or if they're even taking it?
Yeah, great question. So there are over 570 federally recognized tribes. So I, by no means, am an expert in what is going on in every single one of those communities. And that's just the federally recognized tribes. There are also state tribes and other regional corporations and villages. So again, it's a very complex issue. I will say that I was just on a call with the director of the Indian Health Services last week, and some folks that are helping administer the vaccines in the Oglala Sioux tribe and then also in the Navajo Nation. So two of some of the largest of the tribal nations in our country. I will say that folks seem to be pretty eager, especially like I mentioned, there has been a lot of positive messaging around this. And so a good friend of mine helping deliver this in Navajo Nation sent me a picture of cars lined up 2 miles back to get their elders the vaccine on opening day for elders in the community. So there obviously is a sense of urgency around this, and I think a general openness to it. Again, I say that with a lot of hesitation, not to be painted with broad strokes or to generalize to every community, because it is different from community to community. But I don't think that there has been a huge divergent trend from those communities to anything else I'm hearing otherwise in any other communities.
Okay, there's a question posed. How is the distribution being handled in the nursing homes?
I can respond to that because I actually had read about that. The nursing homes were given, I think there's 1,100 nursing homes across Colorado, and they were either getting direct allotment, or if the appropriation had already been made to the state, they were being encouraged to send those to the nursing homes. I think they're almost done with all the nursing homes at this point because they had the direct allocation, as well as shifting some of that from the allotment that the state had received.
We're getting through these. We're getting into the last minutes too. So I'm going to kind of keep us moving, Joss.
Okay. So due to the limited supply now, is there a possibility that there will be a vaccine shortage by the spring?
You know, I don't know, but and this is, I'm not having any inside information, but what you hear on the news is that these companies are making vaccines at an incredible fast rate. So they're actually increasing the production, and there's going to be a very heavy amount of investment to continue the production. So I don't think so. I don't know if somebody else has a different thought in the panel, though.
I would say, oh, go ahead, Jared.
Oh, well,
okay, go.
Thanks. Sorry. No, I agree. I'm not privy to any unique information that I don't think anybody else on this panel is, but I will say something that Dr. Terry brought up earlier about the differences in the ability to deliver some of these vaccines and the capability of delivery based on restrictions of storage and transportation. So I think there is some general concern that particular amounts of vaccines that can be easily delivered in resource strapped and resource limited communities, how much there are out there. But that's not to say that there have been any true signals yet that I've seen or that I've been made aware of an actual impending limitation. It seems like we continue to hear really remarkable rates of vaccine development, not only in terms of the actual development, but like the production of it. So I do hear and understand why that's a concern for many communities, especially resource limited communities, but I haven't heard anything.
And the only thing I would add is that there's like over 100 vaccine candidates that, that are in trials. And I had heard of the AstraZeneca might be the next. People are talking about Johnson & Johnson, but there's also AstraZeneca that's going to be coming out soon. So the reason there are so many candidates is because so much needs to be made. We have 330 million residents in US alone, and we're talking about worldwide. This is a pandemic. Everybody's got to get vaccines. So that's why there's so many people working on it. Hopefully we don't run out. I think they now know how to get this produced much more quickly than maybe in the past. So I don't think there'll be shortages, but they can only make so much at one time.
And I would say, I just want to echo what Dr. Terry said. The decision to get vaccinated is an individual one, but think about also in your community. The more people get vaccinated, the less likely is that this pandemic continues to expand and infecting and killing people. So think about those that are around you that you protect when you decide to social distance and wear a face mask and get the vaccination. This is an effort that we all have to contribute. As someone who has worked several times we have multiple COVID ICUs in the hospital, and I've just shocked that the great majority of the patients that I've taken care of in the ICU were Hispanic. I mean, I'm not kidding. Over 2/3 of them were Hispanic, Latinos, or Latinx. And it's just devastating. And I've seen people that have died in their 30s, in their 20s, in their 40s, and older. So this is not a disease that happens only to the elderly or people with diabetes. We've seen people, my colleagues and I, we've seen people die from COVID in the ICU without any pre-existing conditions that were otherwise young and healthy. And just saddens you profoundly when you think about that potentially, not all of them, potentially some of these situations could be prevented. I would like to just leave people with the thought that if you have an opportunity, vaccinate yourself. You do not want to be the next person in a ventilator in the ICU. You do not want to go there. I 100% guarantee you do not want to be that person.
I also I'm sorry to keep chiming in, but one thing I really just want to emphasize is oftentimes this decision-making around to get vaccinated or not, in my mind, is often a very privileged one to be making. And I think, I think this is an empirical question, but I think that's why so many Native communities are jumping on board. Although there's a lot of history to make them hesitant, I think that we're seeing an adoption of it because it is about a community decision. It's not something they have a privilege to say we have resources to fend it off if we get it. We have the ability to keep grandma safe because grandma lives with you and you also live with your great grandkids, right? So it's a very privileged decision sometimes to make if you're going to get vaccinated or not. And so we want to remind folks of that privilege, and we want to remind folks that this isn't about you. This is about everybody.
100%.
Sorry.
I know we're getting close to that we're probably going to have last question. And I know that there was some comments that were going on internally as well too. So I just want to be responsive to this last question because we are at that mark. So we have one question left.
I was going to throw it to Josh. Because there's a question to be inclusive of all panelists. If you have that question.
I do. So there's a question that says, wondering where the intersection of health literacy, education, which is correcting incorrect mistrust rumors, healthcare policy, and community join together in a systemic way.
Wants to jump in? We have about 2 minutes.
The toughest question at the end, right?
We're kind of looking to our emerging leaders here, hoping they've got some insights for us.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you mind repeating the question one more time?
Yeah, so wondering where the intersection of health literacy, education, healthcare, policy, and community join together in a systemic way.
That's a really great question, and it's something that I am actually working on as a Master's of Public Health student, is how we distribute information to people in ways that make sense, and how we change the systems, the healthcare systems, to be equitable and have favorable outcomes. For me, especially, is my research is favorable outcomes for women of color. And I think a lot of the discussion could be around, like, how do we make sure that we get information we have so much data, we have so much science that is going on, and COVID research is going at the speed of light right now. How do we get that information and the good information out to people in a way that makes sense, and not just in these big academic journals with huge words that nobody understands, and nobody's going to be looking to these big academic journals. I would rather watch some Facebook video of somebody talking about people putting microchips in the vaccine, because that's easier for me to understand and digest. When the New England Journal of Medicine is talking about all of this stuff that they're using proteins and all this kind of stuff that I don't understand. So how do we get that big data, big science out to our community members in a way that makes sense, and in a way that gives people the correct information, so we don't have to look towards other sources that are giving us malinformation? I think that's one step that we can do, is figure out different streams of getting information out to the public, and being transparent about not only what's in the vaccine, being transparent about how it's being distributed, being transparent about the ways that we are studying the vaccine, and who is in these trials for the vaccine, getting all of that information to people in a way that just makes sense and is easy to digest.
Stephanie, in order to achieve that, I think we need a coordinated, serious, cohesive national response, right? It has to be like a big effort.
Because not only does it need to be easy to understand, it needs to be easy to find. Like, we have all these places that you can go to 17,000 different places right now on the internet and get infinite information about it. It needs to go one spot, one shot, that people are going to be able to access it and understand it.
November 20.
I was just going to say one thing to add to this. I know we're on time, so I'm not going to even be long, but I think Dr. Jared made a really good point earlier about how we're always expecting community to come to the table, or that we want to have community at the table, but we need to bring the table to community, and we need to start really having some of this synergy. And I think we will see things start to change. But to Dr. Fernando's point, we need that to be centralized. So I think really the folks on here are doing this work and trying to have these conversations. And even what we did today was a step in the direction. I don't know if y'all saw it, 500 participating. So we are starting that wave. So.
And I'll just say, I told y'all at the beginning, one was not going to be enough. That's all I'm going to say to y'all. I told you, one was not going to be enough.
First of all, I would like to thank each and every one of you for being here, for sharing your knowledge, for engaging in this real talk. I'm going to send a special shout out to Hilda, who was doing our interpreting for us. I know that we are at time, but Hilda, I'm going to invite you in. If you have any last words that you would like to say in Spanish to this community, please share those now.
Sorry. Thank you. Good night, man. Thank you.
Can't hear you. Can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Because I am in the Spanish channel. So unless you're in the Spanish channel, you can hear me. But I just wanted to thank you, all of you. I'm talking to everybody in Spanish and thanking them for coming. But I'm in the Spanish channel, which you are not going to be able to hear because you're in the English channel.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who stayed on, that participated, that listened. This was truly real talk. Let me extend an additional thank you to our IT folks, as well as to Josh and to Latifa for flowing the questions. We had 107 in the Q&A, and you all summarized them, I'm assuming, very, very well. This was rich, and please look out for part 2. We will most definitely be doing that because clearly this was a start. This was to raise awareness, and we need to follow up and be consistent. Stay safe, everyone. Stay healthy, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.